because let's be clear here, Britain does not owe a single penny to anybody in the Caribbean nations. This is nothing more than, some sort of avaricious cash grab by, by left-wing activists in the Caribbean, but also bad faith political actors who are trying to really capitalize and exploit our current, sort of nihilistic wave of self-flagellation that we're enduring in this country. There are two key points here. Firstly, we've more than paid our debt. The British government paid £20 million in 1833 to free the slaves. That's a sum equivalent to £20 billion today. It was 40% of its budget in 1833. And yes, that money did have to be paid. It's all about realpolitik. If the law to get slavery abolished was going to pass, it meant that you did have to do a deal with the slave owners. That's just a sad reality of the situation in the 19th century when, of course, you had rotten boroughs and so forth. Additionally, the British government spent 2% of GDP, a sum equivalent to our entire current defence budget, on the West Africa Squadron, the Royal Navy fleet that went to enforce an abolition of the slave trade on the Atlantic, not just for British ships, but actually seizing foreign ships and trying to stop Africans, because Africans are actually one of the most vocal opponents of an end to the slave trade. And so the cost of actually ending slavery probably negated any of the profits that were achieved through slavery, because slavery actually didn't contribute that much to the British economy. The second point to make is that there are no victims of slavery alive today, victims of British Empire slavery, I should say. And this is key because reparations are fundamentally an issue of tort law. That's T-O-R-T, tort law. And the purposes of reparations is to put the victim back into the position they were in before the harm occurred. So if we were talking about this in the 19th century and there were people alive, I would absolutely support reparations. But we're talking about 200 years ago. That's 6 or 7 generations. And no one can tell me that the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of slaves in the Caribbean have a worse life than if their ancestors had never left West Africa, which is where they came from.
Rafe, clearly what people are suggesting here with these numbers, I mean, £19 trillion, that's more than the entire GDP of China. But perhaps, if the British never arrived in the Caribbean and these people were left to set up their own country, perhaps it would have a bigger economy than China today. Perhaps they would be the most powerful and most wealthy nation in the world, and the only thing that stopped them, the only thing that kept them less rich than they might have been, was the dastardly British.
Well, it's nice, but unfortunately, Wakanda wasn't built in Liberia, wasn't built in Ethiopia. The sad reality is there's no evidence to suggest that there would be any of the development that we've seen in Africa, or indeed anywhere amongst, some of those colonies later on elsewhere in the Pacific and so forth, were it not for colonialism. The first thing to say, of course, is that the slave trade ended before actually the European nations began developing their colonies in Africa. So that's the first point to make. The second thing is, of course, Liberia and Ethiopia I mentioned because they were never colonized. So those are two states in Africa that never experienced colonization. Liberia was actually set up by slaves. But let's compare, for example, Benin in West Africa to the Caribbean, right? So the annual GDP per capita in Benin is $1,400 a year. It's $17,000 in Barbados. Life expectancy in Benin is 10 to 15 years shorter than it is in the Caribbean. So by every measure, it's impossible for me to see in what way the lives of people today have been impoverished by slavery if you are living in the Caribbean. Most of the Caribbean nations are middle-income countries who rank higher on the Human Development Index than Brazil or Mexico. And one of the reasons they're middle-income countries is because of their British colonial inheritance. The English language and the common law have made them able to become global players in the world economy. They've got all of the infrastructure of parliament and the judiciary and the civil service and universities and the police structure, all of the things that Britain left behind. I'm not saying that Britain had no evil side to its role in the Caribbean. Horrendous atrocities were committed. But today, in the 21st century, it's very hard to see how that legacy is anything but a positive.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, historian and broadcaster. Always great to speak to you. Yeah. It could happen.
No, but it's a fascinating comparison, isn't it? Should we compare, I don't know, Jamaica to a country that the British never colonised, Haiti? I mean, which is richer? Which is richer?
there's a huge push for this. A lot of people working behind the scenes on this type of thing, where it comes from academics to activists to politicians to government officials,
But it's all
to leaders of
entirely
these various
fictitious.
countries,
I mean, 19
all pushing for this
trillion.
idea of Western reparations, particularly the British.
I mean, so some islands in the Caribbean are going to get more money if this were to be approved. And of course, the government doesn't want to approve it. More money than the entire Chinese economy. I mean, the UK GDP, I can't emphasise this enough, is less than £3 trillion. That's the entire UK economy. And they want reparations from us worth 19 trillion.
How many people of Caribbean heritage are living in the UK? It would be their taxes too that would have to pay for this extraordinary sum. I mean, it's just crazy.